that's the one. Yeah?
Yes.
So,
bring you to order.
if you are staying for my session, please. Can everybody hear me? Can anybody hear me? Even more to the point. Yes? Okay. If you are staying for the session, come closer, but also be able to see a screen, preferably. Yeah, see me and the screen simultaneously. Excellent. And if you're not staying for the session, can you find somewhere else to chat so that we can have this session in here, please? So I think we're officially 3 minutes behind schedule, which is almost in time. Great. Okay, so if this is our crew, we're going to get started. Welcome, everybody. I'm, as the screen up there says, Rabbi Professor Deborah Kahn-Harris, and I am the principal of Leo Baeck College here in London, which is our very own seminary for the progressive movements in the UK. And I am the principal, which means I run the place. I'm also a lecturer, or technically I'm a professor of Hebrew Bible at the college. And the session I'm about to deliver is based on my book that came out last year, but is also really more fundamentally based in the teaching that I do at the college. So I teach the Megillot, but all 5 of them, and this book that I did is on the book of Ruth. So we're just going to get stuck in. I could talk for an hour if you let me, so don't let me. Please feel free to ask questions. Just stick your hand in the air or give us a shout if you've got questions at any point, okay? And I'll do my best to answer or say we're going to get to that in a minute or whatever. Okay? Woohoo. So, this is my very basic plot of the book of Ruth. I cannot see the text well enough to read it from here, but I know the plot of the book of Ruth. But not everybody does. Not everybody knows it super well. I'm hoping there are a few rabbis in the room who can help fill us in. But it's really important just to know the outline of the story. It's a 4-chapter work. There are really only 3 major characters. There are a few important but minor characters. Can anybody tell me what happens briefly? Otherwise, I'll spend the whole session doing it. The first chapter of the book of Ruth. Anyone? Can anyone tell me what happens in the first chapter of the book of Ruth? Anybody happen to know? Yes, please. Speak up loudly.
Ruth and Orpah's husbands die?
Yes, so we have a family of people from Bethlehem who leave Bethlehem because there's a famine and they move to the land of Moab. And that's Elimelech and Naomi and their 2 sons, Machlon and Chilion. And Elimelech dies first. Machlon and Chilion marry 2 Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah. And then Machlon and Chilion die. That's actually like the first 5 verses of chapter 1. It's quite an eventful chapter. After they die, Naomi decides that to go back to Bethlehem where she came from, right? And she tells her daughters-in-law, you go back to your homes, don't come with me. Her daughters-in-law cry and weep and say, don't send us away. And then eventually Orpah goes back to her mother's house and Ruth continues with Naomi. And we know that famous passage because we chanted a bit of it in the service where Ruth says, wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Where your God will be my God. And wherever you die, that's where I will be buried. And nothing but death shall ever part us. And they go back to Bethlehem. Chapter 2. What happens in chapter 2? Any takers? There are rabbis in the room. I know you know this stuff. Some of you are even my students. Mark.
Oh, yes. That is the gleaning one.
Yes. It's the gleaning chapter. Excellent.
Just like it says in the book of Leviticus, leave the corners of your field to glean,
They did indeed. And who goes a-gleaning?
People who are poor, strangers, the hungry, whoever it happens to be around who needs food.
Indeed. And in this case, that is Ruth. Because Ruth and Naomi are widows, and they apparently have no other means. So Ruth goes gleaning in whose field? Boaz. Oh my God, what a surprise. So she goes gleaning in his field. He meets her. He's extremely generous and kind to her. He makes her sit and have lunch with them until she is completely satiated, full to the brim. He gives her extra food to take home to her mother-in-law, Naomi. And when she gets back to Naomi, Naomi says, "Oh, he's your relation." Indeed, it's a great word in Hebrew, modatana. He is one who is known to us. Right? And in Hebrew, of course, the word to know has all sorts of interesting possible options for what it means. But he's a relation, and you should stick to gleaning in his fields. Don't go anywhere else. He said he would look after you. Chapter 3. Now this is another famous chapter. They're all very famous. What happens in the famous chapter 3? This is the threshing room floor winnowing scene, okay? So Naomi says to Ruth, "I've got to sort you out," right? She's a good Jewish mother. She says to her, we have to look after your well-being and welfare. You need a husband. This is what you're going to do. You are going to go down to the threshing room floor when Boaz is eaten his fill and nicely intoxicated, and he falls asleep on the floor. You're going to go and lie down next to him. There's a kind of ambiguous bit where somebody's supposed to do some kind of undressing. It's often translated, "You shall uncover the place of his feet," which either means you should unclothe some portion of Boaz, or you should take off your clothes at the place where his feet are. It's unclear. The grammar is very vague there. And when he wakes up, you should say to him, "You're my closest relation. You need to do something about me." He wakes up. What's his response? What is Boaz's response when he wakes up in the middle of the night? But before that even, he's like, "Wah!" He's startled. The text says he's literally frightened. He's shaking. And then he says, what are you doing here? She says, well. And he says, "Well, it's very lovely of you to think of me, but there's actually," as you said, well, in a closer relation, right? And, but don't worry, I'll sort it out. In the meantime, stay here until morning, take some food, and then go back to Naomi. And Naomi says, when she gets back, "Don't worry, he's going to sort it out before the end of the day. I'm quite sure about it." Chapter 4. It all gets sorted. Thank you very much. It all gets sorted. So what's your name? Shirley. Shirley's got it in one. It all gets sorted. You've got it in one succinct sentence. Broadly speaking, Boaz goes, he tucks to the closer relation, he connives a way to get the closer relation off the scene, he sorts it all out, he gets everybody to agree that he should marry Ruth. There's some strange subplot about a field that has never appeared before in the book, but he sorts the field out as well. He redeems a field that belongs to Naomi. He gets everybody to agree that he should marry Ruth. Everybody blesses the union. In one swift sentence, he marries Ruth, they lie together, God gives her a pregnancy, and she bears a son. Whose name is? For Naomi, she does. Right, so the next verse is where Naomi takes the child, puts the child on her breast, and becomes its wet nurse, foster mother, something like that. Yes, it is possible for postmenopausal women to breastfeed children. All women can breastfeed children. Biologically speaking, it is possible. That's another side note, but it is important for us to realize that she's not just, it is plausible that that's what the text is telling us. And the women of Bethlehem say to her, your daughter-in-law is better for you than 7 sons, and she's borne you this child for your old age, and his name is Oved, which means servant, worker, something like that. And then it ends with a genealogy that begins with the line of Perez, who's actually the son of the tribal leader Judah, and ends with David. And in between that is Boaz and Oved, and some other interesting figures, but we don't have time to go into Nachshon. Okay, so that's the book of Ruth. Really important for us to know the background. I'm going to whiz us along to the stuff that is interesting, but if you don't know the plot, it's hard to discuss it. So, this is the story that I was told growing up about the book of Ruth, and maybe many of you will be familiar with. I'm calling it the normative story. The book of Ruth is a charming love story about the poor widowed Ruth falling in love with the wealthy older landowner Boaz and living happily ever after. Nice painting by Dante Gabriel Rossetti from pre-Raphaelite period. Very romantic. I can't see the date here, but I think it's 18. Thank you. I should know, my daughter's doing an art history exam tomorrow. Anyway, on this period. Anyway, so this is the story that many of us are familiar with. It's kind of looks like it might be set in a barley field somewhere. It's not actually a scene from the book, right? It's a sort of scene that you might imagine is in the book, but it isn't actually a depiction of something we know happened in the book, right? At no point do we see Boaz and Ruth gazing longingly into each other's eyes, about to have a romantic embrace and kiss in the middle of a barley field. But it's the sort of thing that sounds plausible, right? And it's the story that certainly I was told, right? This is what this is really all about. From about the early 1990s, you start to encounter academic articles in which people are already recounting traditions that are taking place. So they're talking not about a new interpretation, but things that are happening in communities where lesbians are reclaiming this story for their own. I've called this the subversive story. This is, by the way, a painting virtually contemporary with the Rossetti, but by a female artist named Evelyn de Morgan, who's also part broadly of the pre-Raphaelite school. And here you see a picture of Ruth and Naomi. This is a highly erotic picture, for those of you who know anything about pre-Raphaelite art. Redheads are the most beautiful women in the world. The nape of the neck is the most erogenous zone in a female body. This is not just a mother-in-law and her daughter-in-law grieving together and going merrily on their way on the road to Bethlehem. And lesbians for a long time understood that that beautiful piece that we just talked about, where Ruth declares her loyalty and commitment to Naomi, is really an expression of her love, and not in the maternal sense, for Naomi. And for many years, again, even before the 90s when the academic stuff started to come out, we know that lesbians were using those words as part of their commitment ceremonies. And that they saw this story something, an echoing of their own experience. That it was a story that was below the surface, but that was plain to see if you were looking for the right clues, right? That, you know, in the way, and again, those of you who are more my age than, say, Katie's age, will remember that for many, many years, gay and lesbians had to create their lives in a way that they knew what they were doing, but to the external world, they could hide their lives. And they saw that in Ruth and Naomi. That Ruth and Naomi loved each other, and there was a way that they could exist in this world, but they had to kind of hide it behind a heterosexual marriage to Boaz for Ruth. And And here are a couple of examples I just want us to see of some of those academic readings. These are queer readings, LGBTQI plus readings of these texts. One of them, and I didn't realize the screens would be quite so far away, and I hope people online can still hear me. But I'm going to do this. One of them is by Rebecca Alpert. That's one of those early lesbian academic texts I was talking about. And she says, what made Ruth want to follow Naomi? Lesbian midrash can answer this question in ways that may fill in the blanks about Ruth and Naomi's relationship. So she is looking for a midrashic approach, an interpretive approach, to saying, how do we fill in this question? Why does Ruth want to follow Naomi? Where are the clues in the text for that, right? Would you follow your mother-in-law from the land of your birth to a place where you might not be welcome to hang out with her for the rest of your life? I love my mother-in-law, but probably I would have to think very seriously about that, right? So that's one reading. In the year 2000, this article was published by a woman named Selena Duncan. And Duncan is a bisexual woman. She's actually a practicing Christian. And she wrote a really interesting article about how she saw her own life reflected in the story of Ruth. And it's a really interesting article because it's interwoven an academic article with her own autobiography. And she explains how she can see in Ruth a bisexual woman, a woman who first falls in love with her mother-in-law Naomi in a lesbian relationship, and later falls in love with a man who is Boaz, right? And she explains how that happened in her own life and her own pastor's response to it. And she sees for herself a role model in Ruth. And I think it's hopefully it's quite straightforward, that understanding of the text. And then just to round it off, the last article is by an academic by the name of Hugh Piper. He's Emeritus Professor of Hebrew Bible at the University of Sheffield. And he wrote a really interesting piece queering Boaz. So he's really interested in shifting our gaze. So for many, many of us, we read texts and we identify as who we are, right? So we assume everybody is like us. So if I read the text as a cisgender heterosexual woman, that is a female who was born female and who identifies as heterosexual, then I kind of assume that that's how all the women in the text are, right? And I am not a heterosexual cisgendered man, but if I were, I might assume that all men in the Hebrew Bible are like that. And Piper, who is himself gay, says, well, wait a minute. What if we didn't work from that assumptive position? What if I assumed maybe Boaz is a gay man? What would that look like? Are there textual clues? And he finds plenty, amongst which are like, if you wake up in the middle of the night and you're a red-blooded heterosexual male and there's a naked woman lying at your feet, do you shake and go, oh my God, what's happening? Maybe, or maybe not. But he also says there's some other really interesting stuff happening in the text. In the gleaning sequence, he says, note that Boaz is surrounded by young men. The head of the reapers is a young man. Boaz exists in a world where he is the alpha male, he's unmarried, he has no progeny, and he's surrounded by young men. Exactly. Think about that one. When he says, who's that attractive young woman over there? He could mean, she looks pretty. Or he could mean, you all are going to be very distracted. I don't like that. Right? So again, it depends on our perspective. And for many years, and there are a couple of you in the room who sat in my class, I read all three of these articles with my students for years and years. And we talked about the different readings, and we talked about how they might interact with each other. And then one day, Hugh Piper asked me to deliver a paper at an academic conference. And I said, for a long time, I've been trying to work out whether all three of these things could possibly be true at once. So, could all three be true at once? The thing about all three of these models is that they depend on monogamous, dyadic relationships. In the case of bisexuality, they rely on those relationships being sequential. Okay? A dyad is two people. That's all it means. Okay? Monogamous, well, I hope you all know what that means. And it is monogamy, just so we all are clear, is only been the fundamental form of Jewish marriage for about 1,000 years. It is not fundamentally the most basic form of marriage in the Hebrew Bible, right? It's not the assumptive state. It is for us. It has been since Rabbi Gershom's Takana, but not in the biblical text, okay? So again, for me, it was about thinking outside of my own framework. Just because I am a cisgendered heterosexual woman in a long-term monogamous committed marriage doesn't mean that's how everybody is. And what would it be like if I tried to think about a different way to think about the problem? This is a long academic quote about monogamy and polyamory. And so, just to be really clear, what she's basically saying is that she says, the notion of monogamy in literature as a reflection of a natural phenomenon does not stand up for long, right? She says, even if it would be to assume that monogamy is an unremarkable and static aspect of culture, it's not a static element in literature or in fiction. It's a dynamic presence in fiction. How many films have you seen or books have you read that are based on the notion that there are two suitors and she's got to pick one of them, right? Or two women and he's got to pick one. Or three women and she's got to pick one. My grandmother used to say you should have a date on every corner and decide which one you want to date every day. So we can't presume that monogamy is the only way of being in the world, even if it's the way we're socialized and acculturated to be raised. There are other solutions, and when I started to think about what those other solutions were, there are three main characters. Why can't there be a solution for three people? Right? So, and when I started to think about it, I realized that there were two key triadic relationships in the book. But first, just for a moment. The general form of sanctioned relationship in the Hebrew Bible is patriarchal polygamy. What do I mean by that? The Hebrew Bible assumes that men can marry multiple women. Can you think of men who are married to multiple women in the Hebrew Bible?
Yeah. Solomon.
Abraham, Solomon, David.
Jacob.
Okay. Yes, indeed. Elkanah, think of ones who were only married to one woman. You can, but in fact, most of them bring either full other wives or what are known as secondary wives into the marriage, in Hebrew, pilagesh. And this was a means of enhancing your family unit. And it's the typical form of marriage in the Hebrew Bible. So for us to assume that things have to be sorted out into monogamous pairs is perhaps less rational a thought than to assume some other kind of solution. So, the first triad in our text is this one. It's Ruth, Naomi, and Orpah. Now you might say to me, oh, Deborah, you said the first 5 verses. By the first 5 verses, Machlon and Chilion are dead and she's starting to chuck the women out. One of the little tiny details of the text that many people overlook is this one. Elimelech knows Naomi's husband died and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth, and they lived there about 10 years. Ruth, Naomi, and Orpah lived together for about 10 years. That's not an insignificant period of time. Does anybody know what the names Machlon and Chilion mean?
Sickly and destruction.
Yeah, illness and destruction, or something like that. This is called nominative determinism. If your name is sickly, no. What notably does not happen in the 10 years that they are married to children? What almost exclusively happens in the biblical text when a woman is married for any length of time and doesn't have children, what is she referred to as? Barren. Are Ruth and Orpah referred to as barren? No, that's unusual, right? Sometimes we have to listen for what's missing in the text as much as for what's in the text. They're not called barren. Their husbands are named Sickness and Destruction. Now we have to think with our midrashic imaginative hats on. What kind of life did they lead for 10 years? What was going on in this household where you had sickness and destruction and these three women? Who's doing the cooking, the subsistence farming, the cleaning? Who do we think? Sickness and destruction? Somehow, for 10 years, these three women held a household together. They didn't get pregnant, they didn't have children. My best guess is they were probably caring for ill husbands who eventually died. This is actually a lithograph by Marc Chagall. I think it's a beautiful representation of how these women might have existed together. Again, this depicts three women. We can assume that the central figure is Naomi. I don't know which one is Orpah and which one is Ruth. They are almost merged into each other, right? You can look at the white space versus the lines. They are like a single column with Ruth and Orpah holding Naomi up. But equally, you can see Naomi supporting them as well. There's something about a triad that's stable, right? We think of monogamous relationships, they should be stable and long-lasting. If you put a table up on two legs, what happens? Al shlosha devarim ha'olam omed. On three things does the world stand. Three is the fundamental number in nature that makes things solid, that makes things secure, that makes things stable. And here you have a stable triadic relationship that goes on for 10 years. Is it any wonder that when the men die and Naomi goes back on the road, that her daughters-in-law follow her? They go with her, and Naomi doesn't think about it. It's only part of the way along the road that Naomi says to them, "Oh, I think you should go home, because there's nothing for you in Bethlehem. You're Moabites. I don't know what I can do with you there, and there are no more children left in my womb. I can't get you new husbands. Go home." Right? But they're a stable, secure, caring unit. Are they lesbians? I have no idea. I don't know who's sleeping with whom, and I don't care. What I care about is the emotional connectedness of this unit. And this is something more, I think, than just how I feel about my mother-in-law, right? This works until Naomi figures out that she's got to break up the party. And Orpah, in all her love and care of Naomi, follows her orders. And Ruth says, "I cannot, I have to stay with you." And now there are just two of them. And two, my friends, is an unstable number. So, now we're going to come to what I will refer to as polyamorous polygamy. Yes.
So moving to Naomi, Ruth, and Orpah. I'm just wondering if is there a perspective on Orpah? Orpah does what Naomi needs. Ruth can't leave her.
Yeah.
Ruth's needs. I've always, again, the Hader thing is
Yeah.
for Naomi's needs, lovely Ruth stays. Just for Ruth's needs.
So I could do a whole session. Yes.
Online and asked if you could summarise if there's a comment made from the floor.
With pleasure. So, Robert Mark is asking us, or he's pointing out to us, that Orpah follows Naomi's wishes. She is actually listening to what Naomi says she needs. Ruth's not listening to what Naomi says she needs. Ruth is listening to what Ruth needs. This is true. Orpah gets a terrible deal from the rabbis. Really quite horrific. I mean, massive trigger warnings on this one. So if you need to put your fingers in your ears, do. But according to the rabbis, Orpah, whose name means the back of her neck, she turns her back on Naomi, and on the way home she's raped by 100 Philistines, and her eventual progeny becomes Goliath. They're not very nice to her. There's some wonderful post-colonial commentary on Orpah as the role model of the one who doesn't assimilate, who actually goes back to her mother's house. It's quite an interesting piece. In my reading, Orpah does do the thing that her mother-in-law asks of her, out of love, not out of something. Ruth does the thing that Ruth needs to do for Ruth, and it's really interesting. So lesbians, lots of people, other people, heterosexual people use Ruth's words in their marriage ceremonies. What does Naomi say after Ruth utters these immortal words? Immediately after Ruth says these words, Naomi says nothing. Nothing at all. When she sees how determined Ruth is, she just kept going and stopped arguing with her. When they get back to Bethlehem, she says she's bitter. But she says it not even to Ruth, she says it to the women in Bethlehem. So there's something interesting going on in that dynamic, and you're quite right to point it out, Mark. So I want to talk about what I'm going to term polyamorous polygamy as distinct from patriarchal polygamy. Again, this is a big slide with lots of definitions in it. I can't see the words from this far away, but I'm going to summarize some of the key points about it. In a patriarchal polygamous relationship, you have a man marrying multiple women. He makes all the decisions. He does not seek consent from any of the other women in that relationship. Those women may or may not have any kind of relationship to each other, right? Particularly in terms of quality of relationship. In fact, one of you mentioned Jacob. In fact, Jacob's sister wives fought bitterly with each other and actually had huge animosity between them. Doesn't matter as long as Jacob's happy, right? So that's one of the key things, is that in a patriarchal relationship, it's about power, it's about hierarchy, it's about status, and the only person who gets to decide is the man. Now, consent is a really difficult topic in the Hebrew Bible. There isn't a biblical Hebrew word for consent. And how we would know that people consented to marriage is very hard to determine. For the most part, does anybody know any of the biblical Hebrew words for marriage? Vayikach, and he took. Nasa, and he lifted up. Da'at, and he knew. Yes. None of these words imply consent. They're almost always an action that a man does to a woman, right? The closest thing we have to female consent is when Rebecca is asked by her father and brothers, do you want to go with this man that we've already basically decided you're going to go with to marry? But do you want to go? And she says, yes, I will go. That's it. That's the only woman in the whole text who says anything about her marriage, really. Okay? That's not to say that we know that Jacob dearly loved Rachel, but consent is a whole other question. There's a wonderful book by a scholar named Rhiannon Graybill, and she says that consent in the Hebrew Bible is fuzzy, icky, and messy. Okay? So I can't tell you who consents to what, but we can look for clues. Because in a polyamorous relationship, everybody gets a choice. Everybody gets to decide, do I want to be part of this relationship, right? People are free to express their full humanity within the confines of that relationship, okay? You can read the whole page in more detail, but these are some of the questions I'm looking for. How did each of the people in the relationship express their regard for each other? Is there any element of consent going on? Who holds the most power? Is there a power imbalance? What is the dynamic? How is that working? So we have to look for clues. All right? Sorry, I'm blind as a bat. So the question I want to ask us is, could Ruth, Naomi, and Boaz be in a polyamorous relationship, a polygamous polyamorous relationship? And if they were, how would we know what it looked like? How would we recognize it if that's what was going on? Could they all show regard for each other? Could they each care about each other in their own way? Could they develop a stable, functional relationship between the three of them? And that's why I want to ask this question. What if the book of Ruth isn't just a romance story? What if that's not the only thing the story is about? By the way, don't tell the Hollywood makers of the 1961 film, The Book of Ruth. So we have this midrash from Ruth Rabbah, which is the midrashic text to the Book of Ruth, and it says the following. It says, Rabbi Zerah says, this Megillah does not have anything in it about impurity or purity or what is forbidden or what is permitted, so why was it written? Those are, of course, the only useful subjects for a book to be about, apparently. Why was it written? To teach us how great is the reward for acts of chesed. Who can tell me what chesed means? Oh, yes. Thank you all. Good, thank you. What's your name? Nick. Great, Nick. Everybody tells me it means loving kindness. I just want to tell you this little factoid. The word loving kindness was invented by the translators of the King James Bible to translate the word chesed. Okay? It's a really rubbish translation. When you don't know how to express a word properly, you make up a new word to translate it exactly. So Nick told us it means something like overflowing kindness. Almost. In a technical sense, it means something like that. It means what we do for people above and beyond what we are legally required to do, right? So there's a way in which we are expected and need to behave within a halachic or a legal framework. When we go above and beyond that, we're doing chesed. And Rabbi Zerah says that's what the book of Ruth is about. Why does he say that? For this reason. The book of Ruth uses the word chesed 3 times. This chart is in my book. I made it up. I've never seen anybody else do it. He uses the word chesed 3 times on 3 separate occasions. And I've tried to deconstruct the 3 verses in which it's used. You have somebody who blesses or petitions someone to receive, so you've got someone who blesses or petitions, somebody who has displayed chesed, and somebody who receives chesed, okay? And you have that same formulation on 3 separate occasions. So the first one is in Ruth chapter 1, verse 8. When Naomi said to her daughters-in-law, turn back, each of you to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you. What do you think deal kindly is translated as? Ya'as Adonai chesed. May God deal with you with chesed, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. Okay? So here we have Naomi who's doing the petitioning. We have her petitioning on behalf of Ruth and Orpah, who have done kindness to Naomi and to the dead, i.e. Machlon, Chilion, Elimelech. Very sad microphone. I'm not saying anything.
Not behaving very polyamorously, is
No,
it?
okay. I'm a bit floppy. Okay, anyway. Thank you, Rabbi Paul. In chapter 2, we have when Ruth gets back from gleaning in the fields, and she tells Naomi about what happened. Naomi says, where did you glean? And she says, in Boaz's field. Naomi says, blessed be he who took such generous notice of you. So that, and again, Asher lo azav chasdo et hachayim ve'et hametim. So this is in verse 20. This text is also too small. Naomi said to her daughter, blessed be he of the Lord who has not failed in his chesed to the living or the dead. So Naomi is blessing Boaz, who has displayed chesed to Ruth and to the dead. Okay? And in the last one, in chapter 3, on that famous threshing room floor scene, Boaz says to Ruth, be blessed of the Lord, daughter, your latest deed, and it's translated here as loyalty, but guess what it is? Chesed is greater than the first in that you have not turned to younger men, whether rich or poor, right? So he is blessing Ruth for her acts of chesed. He's blessing Ruth with chesed for her acts to Boaz and Naomi. All right? You guys can see the chart better than I can at the moment. But basically, what is happening here? We have a mix of people. Naomi can bless and petition, and she can receive chesed. She can't display chesed. Ruth can display chesed and she can receive chesed, but she can't bless anybody. Boaz can do all 3, but he's got no one to do them with without Ruth and Naomi. This act of chesed, this overabundance of faithfulness, loyalty, care, compassion beyond what is legally required, ties the 3 of them together. They don't manage to do all 3 things without the other 2. They need each other. It ties them together. There are various other aspects of the story that also tie the 3 of them together. Because we don't have another hour, I can't go into every single bit of it. But one of the core bits that I talk about in my book, it's interesting because Rabbi Mark was asking about what does Naomi actually need? In chapter 4, it appears that what Naomi needs is the redemption of a field. Right? She needs it because otherwise she is a poverty-stricken widow. What does Ruth need? Ruth needs to be married. She needs to have a child. Also, Naomi needs a child. Also, Boaz needs a child. Boaz also needs to be married. They all need each other. And Boaz finds a solution to both Naomi's needs and Ruth's needs. Now you could say, great, off go happily ever after Boaz and Ruth, and Naomi's field is sold, she could get on her own. But didn't Ruth promise? What did Ruth promise? Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your God will be my God, and where you die, there I will be buried, and nothing will separate us but death. How can she go and live in Boaz's house without Naomi? She can't. And they all need this baby boy. And he ties them together, right? His biological parents are Boaz and Ruth, and his foster mother is Naomi. Now, in the bad old days, so to speak, when, say, a lesbian couple wanted a child before they were entitled to IVF treatment, they might have to go find a gay man to help them father their child. I don't know about you, but this sounds a bit like a biblical solution to that problem. Because Boaz also needs that child. And he ties them together. And if you look, and again, I don't have a map of this up here because I don't have endless amounts of time for you. If you look at the structure of the verse that talks about Boaz's marriage to Ruth, and the verse that talks about how Naomi takes the baby to her breast, they are structured exactly the same way. There's a bit of a chiasm for those of you who are Bible scholars. But it works. They are creating rituals that bind them together. In the same way that I am reminded that queer folks used to have to create their own rituals to bind themselves together before our society created legal structures for that. It depends who you ask. It's either very early or quite late. So the book officially starts off saying that it's set during the time that the judges judged. Sorry, the question was, when is the book written? So you could say it's set during the period of the judges, which is before this quite lawless period when they're settling the land, before the monarchical period. It's kind of the Wild West scene of the Hebrew Bible. That's when the book says it's set. Linguistic scholars will tell you that the book represents a form of late biblical Hebrew, but dating on linguistic grounds alone is quite dodgy for all sorts of reasons, partially because you don't know when a story was and when it was edited to look like this story. They don't really know if it's a late biblical Hebrew, maybe it's a northern dialect or a southern dialect. They don't quite know. Some of the stuff that they're looking at are, there are quite a few places, and again, we haven't had time to go into this, where people are misgendered in the text, where two women are referred to with the verbal ending is a masculine ending, for example. There are all sorts of interesting readings you can do off of that as well. So the short answer is you either date it to the same sort of time period as the judges, which would be like, late Bronze Age or something, or you date it post-exilic.
So when it got sort of solidified,
Yeah.
so do you think the authors had the same conclusion as yourself?
I have no idea, and I don't care. I think knowing what was in the mind of the biblical authors of the text is unknowable. And we have a text passed down to us that has been interpreted for more than 2,000 years, and that's what makes it a living and breathing and alive text. The only people I can tell you what they meant by what they wrote are living authors, or dead authors who wrote in great detail about what they intended their works to mean, and then scholars will still argue with you. With the biblical text, who you have no idea who the author is, although according to the rabbis it's the prophet Samuel, then you have to go on on what your own interpretive imagination. In my book, I state very, very clearly that I don't believe this is the solution to the Book of Ruth. It is a solution to the Book of Ruth. In other words, the rabbinic way of reading is that you can hold multiple conflicting interpretations in your head at the same time, and the fact that they are different doesn't matter, and they can all have equal truth value. So I offer this as another reading of the Book of Ruth for this reason, right? And this is the reason why I'm interested in it, ultimately, not as an academic, but as a rabbi. Because there are people in our communities, and you might not know any of them, but I promise you they're there, who are polyamorous. A generation ago, when I was newly ordained, which is now almost 30 years ago, the people who we were looking to include in the text were gays and lesbians. We were asking, where can they find themselves reflected in our texts? And I am asking this question because I am a cisgendered heterosexual woman in a monogamous marriage, because it doesn't personally affect me. I can open up this reading and say, if this speaks to you, if this helps you feel part of our community, if this makes you feel like you too can be reflected in the Jewish tradition, then I want you to have this reading, right? Yes, Nick?
Why do you think it became canon? I mean, I know it's an open question, but it's not quite as odd as Megillat Esther becoming canon. I have no idea why that became canon. But this one, it almost feels like the genealogy at the end is retconned to make it seem necessary.
Okay, I'm just going to summarize. So Nick is asking, why did this get into the canon? Why do I think this ended up being canonized? It's a bit of a peculiar text. Is it just to do with the genealogy at the end? Even though I haven't talked about the genealogy, for those of us who aren't accustomed to reading biblical texts, genealogies are part of a narrative story. They're not just sort of tacked on at the end or wherever. They are important, and I do think it's important. If you think the genealogy is the sort of central denouement of the whole thing, you can get, the more traditional scholarly arguments are things like, well, this is to solidify David's reign, particularly over some of them, to say that part of his lineage is outside of the Israelite community, and therefore he has the right to reign over some of these non-Israelite tribes. That's an answer. Sometimes it's often read as a counterweight to the invectives against Israelites marrying foreign women in Ezra and Nehemiah, and it's seen as a sort of counterweight to that, because look, there are two foreign women in David's lineage, that being Tamar, who's the mother of Perez, who starts the genealogy, and Ruth herself. Why is it canonized? It's a difficult thing, particularly with many of the Megillot, to understand canonicity issues around them, and there are compelling reasons why you might argue them, although it is not one of the texts that the rabbis argue about, right? The rabbis argue primarily about Song of Songs, a little bit about Ecclesiastes. They don't even really argue about Esther, even though it's quite vicious. Some of it may have to do with when the text came into being a generally accepted kind of reading. It's very clear Hebrew. It sets itself during the time of the Judges, which, whether we think that's when the writing actually dates to, would give it weight to being canonized. And it talks about David, which effectively brings it into Israelite history, into the lineage of Messianism, which probably explains it. Did you have a question?
It wasn't a question as much as an observation.
Yeah.
It's interesting that the passage with "Where you go, I will go." Whichever translation, whichever version of the Christian Bible, Hebrew Bible, it resonates down the years, down the centuries. And that's just an observation.
So what's your name?
About the significance
Yeah.
of the whole book. And why is that so resonant?
Sorry, so what's your name?
Marianne.
Marianne is just saying that these famous words of Ruth's, wherever you go, I will go, whatever translation you're looking at, they really resonate. They resonate down the generations to a whole range of people. And why is that? She is asking why I think that might be. They're beautifully crafted words, right? They're extraordinarily well written. The book of Ruth is quite terse. It's a very short work. So it's very finely crafted. It has the highest percentage of direct speech of any biblical text, and those 2 verses are like direct speech, right? You can imagine saying them. You can imagine them being delivered, and you can imagine if someone said that to you, you'd burst into floods of tears and be like, oh my, right? They're really emotionally powerful. There's enough fat in those words, right? It's even more clear in Hebrew than it is in English, right? You need even fewer words to say it in the Hebrew.
So Boaz is quite wealthy.
Yes, Boaz is quite wealthy, yes.
And he's quite old.
And Boaz is,
Oldish.
yeah.
And unmarried.
Yes, Boaz is wealthy, older, and unmarried.
Bit unusual.
Very unusual. The rabbis were very vexed by this. So the rabbis are very worried about it, to the extent that in the Midrash to Ruth, they say, Boaz was married and his wife died the day that the night before Naomi and Ruth returned to Bethlehem. They made it up. They made it up. They had imaginations, just like we do. So I want to just be really clear. The rabbis make things up all the time. It's an interpretation. They look for the lacuna, the gaps in the text, and then they look for an answer. How can a wealthy landowner who's an older man be unmarried? He must have been married. He was just a widow, a childless widow.
What's fascinating is that they felt the need to make that up, which, as you say, shows it wasn't really on their minds.
Yeah, they felt the need to make it up. Absolutely. And yes, Martin.
Do you think that the whole book is a proof text for polyamory? Because the thought that's just come through my mind is that the whole concept of gender and sexuality is very, very different in biblical times. And as you said, in the Talmud, that's when it starts to become what we're more accustomed to now and just starting to move away from. So if that's the proof text for polyamory, then the proof against that of a monogamous relationship, could that be the two brothers who, with a name like sickness and destruction, if somebody was called destruction, you would imagine that they were like a Goliath-type fertile character. Someone who was sickness, is this the sickness and destruction? Is that an incestual relationship?
So I'm just trying to think. So firstly, Martin was saying, do I think that the Book of Ruth is a proof text for polyamory? And then was trying to kind of make a counter claim about machlon chilion, destruction and sickness, as a kind of invective against monogamy, and almost like perhaps there's something almost the word just for that, incestuous about the two of them or something. I don't know. The incestuous part, I think, would probably be stretching way into the Midrashic realm. I think my book is a proof text that you can interpret this as polyamory if you want to, if you're looking to. There's no reason not to. I think that the monogamous marriages to Machlon and Chilion that are childless are clearly not hugely successful, and so there's something going on there. Obviously, lots of people for say about 2,000 years have been reading it without reading polyamory. So there were lots of people who don't think this. But I think you can think this. I think it's reasonable to think this. I think it's reasonable to think that Boaz, Ruth, and Naomi need each other, that they care for each other deeply, and that they create some kind of life together. Now, is that exactly what contemporary polyamory looks like? No, not really. But is it the closest thing I think you're likely to find in the biblical text? Absolutely. And I think we have to imagine that my PhD supervisor used to, we'd have these discussions about the text, and she'd say, you know, people in biblical times had real emotions just like me and you. They weren't stupid, and they, had the capacity to think about things. So if you wanted, in biblical times, to go about creating a mutually respectful, caring, loving relationship between three people, this is how you do it. Okay? And I think that gives us an opportunity in our communities to invite people in, more people than maybe we have before. Nick, and then I think I'm already 3 minutes over time.
Part of that maybe is actually Boaz acts quite oddly for a biblical male.
Yes, he
The
does.
way that sort of kindness that he reacts to, not just the shaking, but then his non-transactional kindness that he has, and the fact that he treats her as a person with agency that he cares about, in a way which is actually quite unusual when I'm thinking about it. He's probably the weirdest one in this text in a funny way.
He is, in a funny way, quite unusual. He treats the women in the text like real people, fully developed human beings, who he wants to interact with at the level at which their needs are met.
The fact that these two women have names is already...
This is also, by the way, the only text in the Hebrew Bible where the word ahav, love, is used to describe a relationship between two women. Right, I'm pretty sure that Tamara's sitting over there so that she can chuck me out of the room. So, but if you want to buy the book, it's available on all good booksellers, probably. Or at least you can order it online, and thank you very much.